Shadow and Evil in Fairy Tales by Marie-Louise von Franz. Chapter 1. The Concept of the Shadow. The psychological definition of the shadow, which we must bear in mind before going into our material, can vary greatly and is not as simple as we generally assume. In Jungian psychology, we generally define the shadow as the personification of certain aspects of the unconscious personality, which could be added to the ego complex, but which, for various reasons, are not. We might therefore say that the shadow is the dark, unlived, and repressed side of the ego complex, but this is only partly true. Jung, who hated it when his pupils were too literal-minded and clung to his concepts, made a system out of them and quoted him without knowing exactly what they were saying. Once in a discussion, threw all over and said, "This is all nonsense. The shadow is simply the whole unconscious." He said that we had forgotten how these things had been discovered and how they were experienced by the individual, and that it was necessary always to think of the condition of the analysand at the moment. If someone who knows nothing about psychology comes to an analytic hour and you try to explain that there are certain processes at the back of the mind of which people are not aware, that it is the shadow to them. So, in the first stage of approach to the unconscious, the shadow is simply a mythological name for all that within me about which I cannot directly know. Only when we start to dig into the shadow sphere of the personality and to investigate the different aspects does there, after a time, appear in the dreams a personification of the unconscious, of the same sex as the dreamer. But then this person will discover that there is in this unknown area still another cluster of reactions called the anima, or the animus, which represents feelings, moods, and ideas, etc. And we also speak of the concept of the self. For practical purposes, Jung has not found it necessary to go beyond these three steps. When we speak of the shadow, we have therefore to bear in mind the personal situation and even the specific stage of consciousness and inner awareness of the person in question. Thus, at the beginning stage, we can say that the shadow is all that is within you which you do not know about. In general, when investigating it, we discover that it consists partly of personal and partly of collective elements. Practically, when we first meet it, the shadow is simply a conglomeration of aspects in which we cannot make out what is personal and what collective. As a practical example, let us say that someone is born of parents quite different in character and inherits from both parents certain characteristics which, so to speak, do not mix well chemically. For instance, I once had an analysand who had inherited a fiery and brutal temperament from her father and an oversensitive touchiness from her mother. How could she be both people at the same time? If someone annoyed her, she was filled with two opposing reactions. In a child, there are opposite possibilities which do not harmonize with each other. In the course of development, generally a choice is made between them so that one side becomes more or less established. Then comes education, which adds to this, and then habit, for by always choosing one quality and giving the attitude preference, it becomes second nature, and the other quality is swept under the table, though it still exists. From these repressed qualities, which are not admitted or accepted because they are incompatible with those chosen, the shadow is built up. With a certain amount of insight and with the help of dreams, it is relatively easy for people to recognize these elements, and that is what we call making the shadow conscious. And with that, analysis usually comes to a stop. But this is no achievement. For then comes the much more difficult problem where most people have great trouble. They know what their shadow is, but they cannot express it much or integrate it into their lives. Naturally, those in the immediate surroundings do not like a person to change, for that means that they also have to readapt. A family will be simply furious when hitherto mild and lamb-like member suddenly becomes aggressive and says no to their demands. It leads to much criticism, and, as the ego of the person concerned does not enjoy this either, the integration of the shadow may go wrong, and the whole problem gets stuck. To have the courage to accept a quality of which one does not like in oneself, and which one has chosen to repress for many years, is an act of great courage. But if one does not accept the quality, then it functions behind one's back. To see and admit the shadow is part of the problem, to say something has happened to me, something has leaked out. But the great ethical problem begins when one makes up one's mind to express the shadow consciously. That requires great care and reflection if it is not to have a disturbing effect. I want here to give you an example. Feeling types are apt to be cruel and narrow-minded in their judgments of their friends. On one side, they feel their way very well through to people, but behind their own and other people's backs, they have the most negative thoughts and judgments about them. The other day, I was in a hotel with a feeling type. I am myself a thinking type, and it happened that when we first met, I was in a tremendous hurry and just rushed past her with a brief greeting, whereupon she made up her mind that I hated her, was furious with her, and that I did not want to spend the day with her, that I was cold, an unrelated person, etc. The feeling type had suddenly switched into negative thinking and had produced a number of negative thoughts with a whole explanation of why I had rushed by. In the beginning stage, the shadow is the whole unconscious, a rush of emotions, judgments, and so on. You might say that my friend was engaged in negative animus thinking, but actually it was an outburst of negative thoughts. Here, the inferior function, brutal emotion, the shadow, and certain destructive judgments, animus in this case. If you study such negative outbursts, you can distinguish between the figure which we call the shadow and the judgment faculty which, in a woman, we call animus. After a time, people discovered these negative qualities in themselves and succeeded not only in seeing but in expressing them, which means giving up certain ideals and standards and entails a lot of consideration and thought if nothing is to be destroyed in the surroundings. Then, since we can also discover in dreams things which seem not to be personal, we say that the shadow consists partly of personal and partly of impersonal and collective material. All civilizations, but especially the Christian, have also their own shadow. This is a banal statement, but if you study other civilizations, you can see where they are better than we are. In India, for example, they are far ahead of us in their spiritual and philosophical attitude in general, but their social behavior to our minds is shocking. If you had walked through the streets of Bengal, you would have seen numbers of people obviously starving to death. They were in extremis, yet no one took any notice, for that is their karma, and people must attend to themselves, to their own salvation. To look after others would only mean being involved in worldly considerations. To us Europeans, this social attitude spoils the whole country, for it is revolting to see people starving and ignored. We would call this plight the shadow of Indian civilization. Their extroversion is below the mark and their introversion above. It could be that the light side is not aware of the dark side, which is so obvious to another civilization. If one lived quite alone, it would be practically impossible to see one's shadow, because there would be no one to say how you looked from the outside. There needs to be an onlooker. If we take into consideration the onlooker's reaction, we could speak of the shadows of the different civilizations. For instance, most Eastern people think that our conscious collective attitude is absolutely unaware of certain metaphysical facts and that we are naively caught in illusions. That is how we appear to them, but we do not see it. We must have a shadow which we have not yet realized, of which we are unconscious. And the collective shadow is particularly bad because people support each other in their blindness. It is only in wars or in hate for other nations that the collective shadow reveals itself. Therefore, you can say that the European has certain bad or incompatible qualities which have been repressed by the individual, that he also has the bad or inferior qualities of the group of which he forms a part, qualities of which he is generally unaware. The collective shadow also appears in another form. Certain qualities within us are diminished when in a small group or when we are alone, and increase suddenly if we are in a bigger group. You see this compensatory phenomenon typically with retiring introverts who have a great longing to be brilliant and the big bug in a crowd. The extrovert is the contrary. When alone, the introvert says that he is not ambitious and does not care. he will not make ambitious intrigues. He will really be himself and content in his introversion. But put him in a crowd where there are ambitious extroverts, and right away he catches the infection. It is comparable to the woman who rushes to a shop to buy something cheap, and all the other women run after her, and when they get home say, "Why on earth did I buy this?" If a person is caught by ambition only when in a group, you could say that it was a collective shadow. Sometimes you feel quite all right within, but you can come into a group where the devil is loose and get quite disturbed, as happened to some Germans when they went to Nazi meetings. Thinking things over at home, they would be anti-Nazi, but when they went to a meeting, something switched and they became, as one man said, as though possessed by the devil. They were temporarily caught by the collective rather than the personal shadow. The collective shadow is still personified in the religious system by belief in the devil or evil demons. A medieval person who had returned from such a meeting would say that the devil had caught him and that now he was free again. On the other hand, we could say that as long as collective demons get us, we must have a little bit of them in us. Otherwise, they would not get us, for then our psychic door would not open to infection. When parts of the personal shadow are not sufficiently integrated, the collective shadow can sneak through this door. Consequently, we have to be aware that these two aspects exist, because this is an ethical, practical problem, and otherwise we may inflict too much guilt on people. Suppose an Alazan behaves outrageously in a group. If we try to make him see that that was all his fault, he's too crushed, and, objectively, that would not be correct, for a part was the group shadow. Otherwise, there might be too great a feeling of guilt, and there is a kind of secret inner norm of how much of the shadow a human being can stand. It is unhealthy not to see it, but just as unhealthy to take too much of it. One cannot function psychologically if one takes on too much. As long as one has a bad conscience, one should take more, but the worst thing is that one often does not see where one's conscience is. It is blurred by looking at the shadow too closely. I say all this to make clear that when we speak of the shadow, there is a personal individual aspect and also a collective aspect, the group shadow. The latter naturally would in some way be the sum of the shadows, and also within the group would be something which does not disturb the group itself and which is apparent only to the outer groups. Practically put, if we put together 3 or 4 typical intellectuals of the same intellectual interests, they will say that they have spent a wonderful evening in intellectual discussions and not noticed that the contact was otherwise bad. But a peasant boy placed with them would say it was a dreadful evening. If all have the same problem, it feels wonderful. Probably all Europeans have many qualities which we do not notice. For us, they are normal. I would like to correct one point. Earlier, I said that only when a group comes up against another group does it realize its shadow. But I was not fully accurate, since in many civilizations, religious rituals tend to make a group aware of its own shadow. In our Christian civilization, this would correspond to the Black Mass, where one would curse the name of Christ, kiss an animal on the anus in the name of the devil, and so on, and the point of it all would be to do exactly the reverse of what one thought was holy. These counter-religious festivals have died out and tend to be forgotten, but they were an attempt to show the crowd its shadow. In many primitive civilizations, there is a group of jesters who would have to do everything contrary to the group rules. They laugh when should be serious, cry when others laugh, etc. For instance, in certain North American tribes, someone is elected to perform in a ritualistic way shocking things contrary to the group standards. There is here probably the vague idea that another side should also be brought into the open. It is a shadow catharsis festival. If you want to see genuine remnants of such things in Switzerland, go to Basel Fastnacht. Although now too many foreigners go and disturb the atmosphere, there you can see the way in which a group brings out its group shadow in a genuine and beautiful way. In the Swiss army, one speaks of the company calf, who is unconsciously selected by a company to play the scapegoat, the man selected usually being someone with a weak ego complex, who acts out the collective shadow under compulsion. You can see the same pattern in the family black sheep who is forced to carry the shadow of the others. Having sketched what we understand by the individual shadow and the collective shadow, we have now to turn into the question of whether and how what we call shadow is represented in mythology. What do fairy tales represent and what do they not? And how far can we take them as psychological material? In former times, until about the 17th century, fairy tales were not reserved for children, but were told among grown-ups in the lower layers of the population. Woodcutters and peasants and women, while spinning, amused themselves with fairy tales. There were also, and they still exist in a few villages in Switzerland, professional fairy tale tellers who were repeatedly asked to relate a few stories. These people are sometimes half-wits and a bit unbalanced, neurotic individuals, while others, on the contrary, are particularly healthy and normal individuals. It is a mixed lot. If you ask them why they do this, some reply that they have inherited the function, and others say they learned it from a cook, or that it is a tradition handed down from one individual to another. We know now that there are fairy tales which are of collective kind and handed on, like the old traditions, from one generation to another. It is a kind of common knowledge. Theories as to the origin of fairy tales are very different. Some say that they are degenerated remnants of religious myths and doctrines. Others, they were once a part of literature which degenerated into fairy tales. It has also been asserted that they are a kind of dream, later told as a story. To my mind, the origin can be seen by the following typical example. In a Swiss family, there was, in the time of Napoleon, a family chronicle in which a miller went out to shoot a fox that then began to talk, saying that the miller should not kill him, for he had helped him with the mill. When the miller returned home, he found the mill turning by itself. Shortly afterward, he died. Recently, a student of folklore went to this village and asked the old people there if they knew anything about the mill, and discovered various versions of the old story. One gave the same story but said that the fox, before being shot, had run crossways through the miller's legs, which produced a fatal infection and inflammation of the skin. Now, in that part of the country, a fox is supposed to cause such illnesses. To the original story, something new had been added. Another variant said that the miller went on to a dinner party where his wine glass broke, and then he knew that the fox was the witch soul of a dead aunt. Witches' souls are said to go about in the bodies of foxes. The story had thus amplified itself with other fitting archetypal material exactly as rumors do. So one can see how a story originates. There is always a nucleus form of a parapsychological experience or a dream. If it contains a motif that exists in the neighborhood, then there is a tendency to amplify the nucleus with it. Now we have the story of a miller who was persecuted by a witch relative that he nearly shot, and then the witch killed him. It is not yet a fairy tale, but just the beginning of one. The name of the miller always stayed unchanged, but supposing the kitchen maid goes to another village and tells the story there, then the miller might be given a different name, or might only be called the miller. All the elements which are not interesting to that village will be dropped, and what is archetypal in the story will remain in the memory. As long as layers of the population have no radios and newspapers, stories form their great interests, and one sees how a folk tale originates. I believe this is how fairy tales came about. I do not reject, however, the theory that they are sometimes remnants of degenerated literature. You can find the watered-down story of Hercules myth in modern Greece, for instance. It has been reduced to its basic structure, and the archetypal material remains, and it is these elements of religious motifs of the past which reappear in fairy tale material. Different elements come together, and the stories are told because they are still interesting and exciting, if not understood. The fact that we have now relegated them to children shows a typical attitude. I could even call it a definition of our civilization, namely, that archetypal material is looked upon as infantile. If this theory of origin is true, then fairy tales would mirror the most basic psychological structures of man to a greater extent than myths and literary products. As Jung once said, when you study fairy tales, you can study the anatomy of man. Myth in general is more embedded in civilization. You cannot think of the Gilgamesh epic apart from the Babylonian Sumerian civilization, and you cannot think of an Odyssey apart from the Grecian, but the fairy tale can migrate better, for it is so elementary and so reduced to its basic structural elements that it appeals to everybody. A missionary was once sent to one of the Polynesian islands, and the first contact he was able to make was by means of a fairy tale. It was the common link. This is true, however, only cum grano salis. Having studied fairy tales for quite some time, I have come to believe that there are typical European, African, Asian, and other types of fairy tales, and though I may be deceived by the changed names, their close relationship is still obvious. Fairy tales are a bit influenced by the civilization in which they first appeared, but much less so than myths because of their more basic structure. Investigators of animal behavior have seen that certain rituals in animal life contains basic structural elements. All kinds of drakes perform a certain dance before mating, consisting of certain movements of the head and wings and several other little movements. It is the ritual way of wooing the female duck. Behaviorists wondered if it might have to do with the genes, and they succeeded in crossing different kinds of ducks and making a new species and watching how they behaved. They discovered that sometimes the old original duck dance ritual was accepted, which had not belonged to either of the varieties crossed, or that the duck dance of one of the partners was repeated in a reduced form, or that there was a combination of two forms. Certain structural elements in the dance of the male duck were always present, and certain other elements varied. If we apply this to man, we could say that there are certain basic structures of the psychological behavior which belong to the human species in general, and others which are more developed in one group or race and less prominent in another. Fairy tales are most generally human in their structure. In each type of tale, you can study the most basic structures of human behavior. But for me, there is another practical reason. By the study of fairy tales and mythological myths, you not only come to know of certain structural complexes, but you are more apt to recognize what is individual and what is not, and to see possible solutions. For example, if you study the myth of the mother complex, that is, the affection and the instinctive behavior of the male child with his mother and all the psychological results of this relationship as mirrored in myths, you can distinguish typical features. The male child tends to develop the features of the hero, of rather a feminine young man of the type of Attis or Adonis or Baldur, who dies young and has a tendency to refuse life, especially with its dark side. According to these myths, the young hero who loved his mother was killed by a dark, brutal, chthonic male being, which means that there is the crucial moment for a young man in that situation when either he is psychologically killed by the wild boar in himself, or, if he refuses to accept his shadow, then he will probably, in modern times, become a pilot and crash, or go to the mountains and fall. If you have a case in which the myth does not appear, in which the dreams are personal, you will probably recognize mythological features in which the young man will dream of a friend who is like Mars or of a wild boar. He will have a personal name, but you can see the basic pattern and the possible solution and development, if you know the myth. You must not preach it. That would be imposing a mythological idea, but you will have a better understanding. One naturally is still influenced by mythological thinking when dealing with this dark male shadow figure of the Analysand. One perhaps tell the myth and say that this reminds one of the Attis Adonis myth and brings to life the whole solution. Such a person then feels that his problem is not unique and insoluble, but that it has been solved dozens of times in certain ways. It also reduces conceit, because one feels that one is in a general situation and not a unique neurosis. The myth also has a magical impact on layers which cannot be reached by intellectual talk. It imparts the feeling of déjà entendu, and yet is always new and awakening. The consideration of the shadow in fairy tales, then, must focus not on the personal but on the collective and group shadow. We can therefore establish only a general view of the way in which the shadow behaves, yet that, to my mind, is very valuable. People are apt to think of my ego and do not realize that the ego is also a general structure and an archetype to our way of thinking. It is an archetype in that it is based on a general inborn disposition to develop an ego and produce certain types of reactions and representations. You could say that in most civilizations everywhere, in different degrees, there is this tendency to develop an ego complex. What is known as I is a general inborn human structure. In the early phases of childhood, a lot of energy goes into building up the ego complex, and if there are disturbances in the milieu, the process is disturbed and the urge may, among other things, cause extreme egotism. This inborn tendency would be the non-personal aspect of the complex, but there is also another inborn tendency, though much less strong, to split off certain parts of the personality from the ego, and these parts create an archetypal aspect of the shadow figure. Only these general structures mirror themselves in fairy tales, and they can be influenced by civilizations in which the tales originate. The fairy tale I want to take first is a German one related by the Grimm brothers, who were the first in Germany to collect fairy tales and arouse interest in other countries to do the same. The story runs as follows. The two travelers. Mountain and valley do not meet, but human beings sometimes do, both good and bad. So it happened that a tailor and a shoemaker met in their wanderings. The tailor was a small, good-looking, amusing, and merry sort of a fellow. He saw the shoemaker on the other side of the road and greeted him with a joke. But the shoemaker did not like jokes, and made a sour face and looked like fighting the tailor. But the little fellow began to laugh and handed him his bottle, saying, "No harm meant. Having a drink and swallow your rage." The shoemaker took a big draught and suggested that they should walk on together. "All right," said the tailor, "if you want to go to a big town where there is plenty of work." The tailor, always merry and fresh and red-cheeked, had no trouble in getting work, as well as a kiss behind the door from the master's daughter, and when he met the shoemaker, he always had more money than he. Although the surly shoemaker was not so fortunate, the tailor laughed and shared that he had with his companion. When they had been some time on the road, they came to a big forest, through which a way led to the king's city. But there were two paths. One took 7 days, and the other only 2, and they didn't know which was which, and debated as to the quantity of bread they should take. The shoemaker wanted to take enough for 7 days, but the tailor was ready to take a risk and trust in God. It was a long way. By the 3rd day, the tailor had finished his bread, but the shoemaker had no pity on him. By the 5th day, the tailor was so hungry that he asked the shoemaker for some bread, for he was quite white and exhausted. The shoemaker agreed, but said that in exchange the tailor must let him put out one of his eyes. The unhappy tailor, who didn't want to die, could only agree, and the heartless shoemaker cut out his right eye. The next day the tailor was again hungry, and on the 7th day too exhausted to stand. The shoemaker said that he would have pity on him and give him more bread, but in return he must have the tailor's other eye. Then the tailor begged God's forgiveness of the light-hearted way in which he had lived, and told the shoemaker that he had not deserved such treatment at his hands, for he had always shared everything with him, and without his eyes he would not be able to sew and could only beg, and he asked what he might not be left there to die alone in his blindness. But the shoemaker, who shut God out of his heart, took his knife and cut out the left eye. Then he gave the tailor a piece of bread, cut him a stick, and led him away. When the sun went down, they came out of the wood by some gallows. The shoemaker led the blind tailor there and left him. Worn out with pain and hunger, the tailor fell asleep and slept through the whole night. When he woke in the morning, he did not know where he was. On the gallows hung 2 poor sinners, and on the head of each sat a crow. The 2 crows began to talk. One told the other that the dew which during the night had fallen on them from the gallows would give back sight to anyone who was washed with it. When the tailor heard that, he took his handkerchief and soaked it in the dew on the grass, washed his eye sockets with it, and had 2 healthy eyes. Soon the sun rose, and in the plain before him was the king's city, with its beautiful gates and hundreds of towers. He distinguished every leaf on the trees and saw the birds fly by and the midges dance in the air. He got out a needle, and then he saw that he could thread it as well as ever. His heart jumped for joy, and he knelt and thanked God. Then he picked up his bundle and went on, singing and whistling. Soon he met a brown colt running about in the field. He seized it by the mane, meaning to jump on it and ride it into town. But the colt begged for its freedom, saying it was too young, that even a light tailor would break its back, and to let it be until it was strong enough, and perhaps some day it would be able to repay him. So the tailor let the colt go. But the tailor had not eaten since the previous day. He then saw a stork and seized it by one of its legs, meaning to cut its head off so that he could have something to eat. But the stork said that it was a holy bird which never harmed anybody and was of great use to the human race, and begged to be allowed to live. It told the tailor that it would make it up to him another time. So the tailor let it fly away. Then the tailor saw on a pond 2 little ducks. He caught one and wanted to wring its neck to have something to eat. But the old duck swam out of the bushes and implored him to have pity on her dear children. "Think," she said, "what your mother would say if someone wanted to make an end of you." So the good-tempered tailor said she could keep her children, and put the duck back in the water. When he came around, he saw an old hollow tree where the bees flew in and out. "That will reward me for my good deeds," he said. But the queen bee came out and said, "If you touch my people and destroy my nest, we will sting you with 10,000 glowing needles. Leave us in peace and go your way. In return, we will one day do you a service." So the tailor went away and came hungry into the town. As it was midday, he entered an inn and ate, and then he looked for work and found a good job. Since he was a very good tailor, he soon became famous, and everybody wanted a coat made by him. And at last he came to be appointed court tailor. But, as happens in life, on the same day his old comrade was made the court shoemaker, and when the latter saw the tailor with 2 healthy eyes, his conscience began to trouble him, and he planned to destroy the tailor before he could tell his story. So, in the evening when he had finished his work, he went to the king and told him that the tailor was an insolent fellow who had boasted that he would find the golden crown which had been lost in olden days. So the next morning the king had the tailor brought to him and ordered him to produce the crown or leave the town forever. The unhappy tailor packed his bundle and prepared to leave the city, though he was sorry to leave the place where everything had gone so well. When he came to the pond where he had met the ducks, there was the old duck cleaning her beak at the bank. The tailor told her what had happened. "Is that all?" said the duck. "The crown fell in the water and is lying at the bottom of the pond. Just lay your handkerchief out on the bank." Then she dived down with her 12 children, and after 5 minutes came up again with the crown lying on her wings, and the 12 little ducks around her, holding it up with their beaks. So the tailor wrapped it up in his handkerchief and took it to the king, who gave him a golden chain as a reward. When the shoemaker saw that his plot had failed, he went again to the king and said that the tailor had boasted that he could produce a model of the royal castle in wax, with everything that was in it. The king ordered the tailor to do this, and said that if there was even a nail missing, the tailor would be imprisoned under the earth for the rest of his life. The tailor thought that things got worse, and nobody could stand that, and again he went away. But when he came to the hollow tree, the queen bee flew out and asked if he had a stiff neck, since he was hanging his head so low. Then the tailor told the story. All the bees began to hum, and the queen bee said he must go home and come again tomorrow, at the same time with a big cloth. When he arrived the next day, the bees had made a perfect model. The king was delighted and gave the tailor a fine stone house. But the shoemaker went a 3rd time to the king and said that the tailor had boasted that he could make a spring of water well up in the king's courtyard, as high as a man and as clear as a crystal. This the tailor was ordered to do under pain of having his head cut off. Once more the tailor prepared to leave with the tears running down his cheeks, but the colt came running to him, and said he knew what was the matter. The tailor must just sit on his back, and he galloped to the courtyard and around it 3 times like lightning, and the 3rd time threw himself down, at which time there was a tremendous crash, and a great ball of earth flew up into the air and over the castle, and immediately after water jetted up as high as a man and horse and as clear as crystal. When the king saw it, he embraced the tailor before everybody. But the good luck again did not last. The king had many daughters, one more beautiful than the other, but no son. And the wicked shoemaker went once more to the king and said that the tailor had boasted that he could bring the king a son through the air. The king called the tailor and told him that if within 9 days he could bring him a son, he could marry his eldest daughter. So the tailor went home and wondered what on earth he should do. Again, thinking nothing was to be done, he made up his bundle and went, saying, "I will leave this place, for here I cannot live in peace." But when he came to the meadow, his old friend the stork greeted him. When he told the story, the stork said he should not grow any gray hairs over that, since he had long brought babies to the town, and for once he could also fetch a little prince out of the well. So the tailor should go home and be quiet, and in 9 days' time he should go to the court where the stork would come. The tailor went home and to the castle at the right time, and soon the stork came knocking at the window. The tailor opened the window, and in came Longlegs, walking carefully over the marble floor, carrying in his beak a child like an angel. It stretched its little hands out to the queen. The stork laid it on her lap. She was overjoyed, and the tailor married the eldest daughter. And the shoemaker had to make the shoes in which the tailor danced at the wedding feast, whereafter he was ordered to leave the city forever. His road through the forest led to the gallows. Worn out with anger and the heat of the day, he threw himself down, and when he shut his eyes and wanted to sleep, the 2 crows flew down with loud cries and pecked out his eyes. He ran around like a crazy man in the wood, and it must have perished there, for nobody ever heard or saw him again. At first glance, you might say that in the 2 travelers, the nice, optimistic tailor represents the conscious side and the shoemaker the shadow, compensatory side. And actually this is an interpretation given even by people who work on fairy tales in a Jungian way. They take it as a typical story representing the ego and the shadow. I think this is, in a way, true, but in my experience, if you start with such a hypothesis, you get stuck. Consequently, I would like to warn you against taking Jungian concepts and pinning them on to mythological figures, saying this is the ego, this is the shadow, and this is the anima, because you will see that this works only for a time, and that then there come contradictions, and finally distortions as people try to force the figures in the story into definite form. It is much better, instead of jumping to conclusions, to look at the 2 figures, at their functional aspects in the story, and the way in which they are constellated in regard to the other characters, and to follow the rule not to interpret any archetypal figures before we have also looked at the context. Then we will come to the slightly different conclusions, that if we just took them arbitrarily as ego and shadow. The tailor is a well-known figure in fairy tales. In the famous Grimm story of the valiant little tailor, there are certain similarities, for the tailor in this other story is also cheerful and light-hearted, of a small, slight build, and not physically very strong. And he defeats a giant and later tricks a furious unicorn. In this story, a unicorn is annoyed and attacks the tailor, who jumps behind a tree, and the unicorn runs his horn into the tree and then cannot free himself. From this amplification, we can conclude that the tailor has something to do with the archetype of the trickster who overcomes his enemies by his intelligence and quick wit. According to medieval ideas, most crafts were connected with certain planets, and every planet protected certain crafts. The planet Mercurius protected, among others, cooks and tailors. The tailor thus belongs to Hermes, that is, Mercurius, and the trickster god, with all his qualities of versatile intelligence, quick wit, and ability to change. In those days, the trade of a tailor was a wise choice for small, rather effeminate men who compensate their weaknesses by their wit and skill. Moreover, the tailor makes clothes for other people. Generally, we interpret clothes as having to do with the persona, and to a certain extent that is correct, for we cover up the naked truth of our personality and show to the surrounding world a more decent facade, nicer than we really are. The idea of clothes as the persona is well illustrated by the Hans Andersen fairy tale, The Emperor's New Clothes. The emperor offers a large reward to the man who can make the best clothes for him, and a witty little tailor goes to him and says he can make every special, delicate, and beautiful clothes which have the magic quality that only honest and decent people can see them. The emperor orders the clothes. He cannot see them, but does not give this fact away, and the rumor spreads in the town that he will appear in his new magic clothes. Everybody admires him until a small child cries out, "But he has nothing on!" And then everybody begins to laugh. Again, the tailor is the trickster who shows up the stupidity of the emperor's persona. On the other hand, if we think of the mystery cults of the late antiquity and of initiations and rituals of many civilizations, we see that people also put on clothes not to represent the persona, but to express their true attitude. For instance, the baptismal ceremonies of the early Christian church, people were totally immersed and then given white garments to manifest their newly acquired innocent attitude, or their candidus white attitude. Also, in the Mithraic initiations and the Isis mysteries, the male initiates wore certain clothes to represent the sun god and to make their inner archetypal transformation manifest to other people. In an alchemical parable, the spirit Mercurius is described as a tailor of men, since he has scissors and cuts men into the right shape. He therefore shapes the people themselves, not only their clothes, and is thus a kind of transformer of men, and a would-be psychotherapist who changes people into their true and right shape. We can say, then, that the tailor has to do with an archetypal power capable of transforming man and giving him a new attitude, a power which has to do with the intelligence and the ability to outwit others. His enemy is the giant. Giants, known for their size and outstanding stupidity, represent in general powerful emotions. As long as you are gripped by an affect, you become stupid. Mythologically, giants are connected with earthquakes. The unicorn, with his aggressive horn, represents the aggressive attitude, and the tailor knows how to contend with this. He also represents the typical human psychological qualities of wit and intelligence by which one can overcome primitive emotion and attain higher consciousness. The tailor in The Two Travelers is moreover a very pious man. For every time he is in any difficulty, he prays to God, in whom he has great faith and confidence, for he optimistically believes that the Godhead will help him out of his difficulties. So we may conclude that the human way of overcoming affect by wit and intelligence is here combined with the Christian religious attitude, the Christian Weltanschauung. The shoemaker also has to do with clothing, but only for the feet, and therefore the difference between clothes in general and shoes has to be specified. If the clothes represent attitudes, then their interpretation must vary in accordance with the part of the body which they cover. You might say that trousers have to do with the sexual attitude and the brassiere with the maternal attitude. A woman who often dreams of a brassiere to represent a criticism of this attitude, a German proverb, says that a man's shirt is closer to him than his coat. It is closer to the skin and therefore represents an intimate attitude. It has been contended that the foot is a phallic symbol for which there is some support, the shoe representing the female organs surrounding the foot. The sexual aspect is implicitly contained in the symbolism of the shoe, but it is not an outstanding aspect. We can assume that the people of the layer of society depicted in this fairy tale would speak more directly and would say sex if that was what they meant. So there is a slightly different meaning. If we start from the hypothesis that the shoe is simply the article of clothing for covering the foot, and that with it we stand on the earth, and the shoe is the standpoint or attitude toward reality. There is much evidence for this. The Germans say when someone becomes adult that he takes off his childish shoes, and we say that the son steps into his father's shoes, or follows in his father's footsteps. He takes on the same attitude. There is also a connection with the power complex, for one puts one's foot down if one wishes to assert power, as the victorious soldier, illustrating that he now has the power, puts his foot on the neck of his conquered foe. In German, there is an expression, quote, the slipper hero, referring to the man who is under his wife's domination. She puts her foot down, and he is subordinate to her in the house. Therefore, you might say that our standpoint toward concrete reality always has to do with the assertion of power, because we cannot take the standpoint of reality without, to a certain extent, asserting ourselves. When it comes to reality, you have to make a choice, to make one side decisive. So the shoemaker would represent an archetypal figure similar to that of the tailor, but one specially concerned with the standpoint towards reality. The shoemaker's trade is regarded as one of the simple professions, even more simple than the tailor's, though neither is socially on a high level according to the bourgeois level of these fairy tales. There are many legends and stories which have to do with the simple level of the shoemaker. There is a legend that Saint Anthony, who saw an angel of God, got the idea that he achieved something and became a great saint. But one day an angel told him that there was still a more saintly man in Alexandria. Saint Anthony, feeling jealous, wanted to see the man, and the angel led him to a very poor quarter of Alexandria and to a miserable hovel where an old shoemaker, who had a miserable wife, sat making shoes. Saint Anthony was amazed but began to talk to him, and, wanting to find out in what way he was more saintly, and asked him about his religious views and attitude toward religion. But the shoemaker just looked up at him and said that he was just making shoes to earn money for his wife and children. Saint Anthony, thereupon, was enlightened. The story shows how the shoemaker has to do with the standpoint toward reality in contrast to Saint Anthony. He strove only to become more and more holy. The shoemaker had a completely human and humble contact with reality, which is what most saints lack, and what was that the angel of God told Saint Anthony. There is a proverb which says, quote, shoemaker, stick to your tools, close quote, for if he leaves them, things go very wrong, which has to do with the relation to reality, for we have to be completely realistic and remain within our own limits. The shoemaker does this and, according to the proverb, is right. After wandering about, at the decisive point, shoemaker and tailor become servants of the king, and the shoemaker starts his intrigues, and the tailor in the end marries the princess who does not become king, which is unusual. In other fairy tales, where the simple man marries the princess, it is implied that through marriage he becomes the new king. But here the stork brings the king a son, who will probably be his heir, not the tailor, unless the child dies, which is not likely according to fairy tale atmosphere. Perhaps we should ask ourselves what it means in general if a simple man like a peasant, or a half-wit, or a tailor, or a shoemaker, or the only child of a widow, marries the princess and thereby becomes the future king. So we must go into the symbolism of the king. For the symbolism of the king, I refer you to Jung's Mysterium Conjunctionis, where there is a whole chapter on this subject. The king represents on a primitive level a personification, or is a carrier of the mystical life power of the nation or tribe, which is why in many primitive civilizations, as you can read in Fraser's The Dying God, and the health and physical and spiritual power of the king guarantees the power of the tribe, and he has to be killed if he becomes impotent or ill. He is deposed after a certain number of years, because the carrier of this power has always to be young. He is an incarnated Godhead and the living strength of the tribe. Among the Shuluks in the upper White Nile, there is clearly expressed by the fact the old king, when he is to be killed, is shut up in a hut with an untouched virgin and starved to death with the girl. The so-called throne, a primitive little chair, is put in front of the hut, and his successor sits there. At the moment of death, the life spirit of the old king enters the body of the new king. From then on, he is the king and carrier of this principle. Again, jumping to conclusions, you might say that the king has all the aspects of a symbol of the self, but this is too general and inaccurate in fact. Though the king is the life principle and image of God, and the center of physical and spiritual organization in the way it carries the projection of the self, the regulating, dominating center of the aspect of totality. But that is not right, insofar as the archetype of the self is, according to our experience, not so much bound to time as that. Also, we have the image of the dying king, or the sick or old king, which has to be deposed, which does not fit with the idea of the self as regulating center of the psyche, which does not have to be deposed. Therefore, in what way is he not the self? The answer is given in the ritual of the shuluks, which I described to you. The king is not the self, but a consciously formulated symbol of that archetype. The king of our civilization is Christ. He is a symbol of the self. He is the specific formulated aspect of the self which dominates our civilization. The king of kings, the dominating content. I would say that Buddha is the formulated aspect of the symbol of the self in the Buddhist civilizations. Thus, the king is not the archetype of the self, but a symbol of the self, which has become a central dominating representation in a civilization. It seems as an archetypal law of general validity that every symbolism which has taken shape and form in collective human consciousness wears out after a certain time and resists renewal owing to a certain inertia of consciousness. Most inner experiences after 10 or 20 years lose some of their strength, and, especially in collectivity, most religious symbols tend to wear out. Think of all the children who should relate to the symbol of Christ and be Christian, and who by the time they are 6 years old are already bored and shut their inner ear because to them it has already become a kind of slogan and makes no more sense. It has lost its numinous qualities and its value. I have also been told by parsons and priests that it is practically impossible always to write a sermon into which they can put themselves, for there will inevitably be days when the man is tired or has quarreled with his wife, when this wearing out effect will be visible. If Christ were completely numinous to him, that would not happen. It seems a tragic fact that human consciousness tends to be unilateral and single-track, not always adapted to inner processes, so that certain truths are formulated and adhered to for too long. The same thing applies to the inner evolution of an individual. Someone has an inner experience and lives it for a while, but then life changes, and the attitude should change. But this is not noticed until dreams show that a readaptation must be made. In midlife, consciousness tends to persist in certain attitudes and does not notice quickly enough that now the inner direction of life has changed. Consciousness should also change for approaching death. Religious contents also, as soon as they become conscious and spoken of, lose their immediate freshness and their numinosity, for which reason the great religious systems undergo movements of renewal, or there is a complete change and renewal or reinterpretation, so that the system regains its immediacy and original meaning. The aging king, who has to be replaced by a new king, expresses the general psychological law. Whatever has reached general recognition is, in a way, already doomed. It would only be wisdom to know that and always be ready for a change of attitude. But just as the individual generally preserves in his old attitude, so does the collective, and to much greater extent. Then you have to face the inertia, which can also be dangerous to the content. The mystery of the renewal of the king refers to this. The king has another aspect. He is not only the profound hope of a civilization, but at the same time the religious representative. An effort was made to evade the unavoidable tragedy of the king having to die from time to time by doubling the power, that is, by having a medicine man and a king. The medicine man is not so much involved in the earthly activities of organization, for his task is to cope with the immediacy of the religious experience. Therefore, in many primitive tribes, there is discord between king and medicine man, who is the gray eminence behind the king, or who is kept down by the absolute rule of the chief. This is a squabble which was carried on in our own history when the Catholic Church tried to be the power over the king, or certain kings tried to replace the Pope, or to govern him and rule the religious life of the Catholic Church. The idea behind the division of power was to keep the two separate, so that the religious aspect should have the possibility of renewal and organization should keep to its own duties. In this way, it might be possible to keep balance in the opposites, the tendency toward the continuity of consciousness and the necessity for constant inner renewal. The drawback is the danger of a quarrel and split between the two powers, which really belong together in the psyche. In fairy tales, it is often the simple person who becomes the next king, after many processes and peripetijas, I guess. We must investigate what this means. If the prince becomes king, he is the right person by inheritance, and we could call that a renewal within the same dominant, like for